Hi, everybody. Susan Storm here with Denzel Mensa. I'm the founder of PsychologyJunkie.com. And Denzel Mensa is, well, he'll introduce himself in a minute. But we're here to continue part 2 of our conversation about the opposing role. The opposing role is the 5th function in your cognitive function stack. And it plays a pretty... Oh, my voice is echoing back to me for some reason. That's because I have YouTube open. Sorry, guys. I realized I had YouTube open, so it was streaming myself to myself as I was talking. This function plays a pretty important part in your life, and we're going to get into... Last week, we talked a lot about the typical ways that the opposing role shows up, and today we're going to talk about some of the positive benefits of this function. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Denzel so he can introduce himself to you and tell you a little bit about what he does in case you're new to our stream.
Yeah, so my name is Denzel Mensa. If you don't know me, I'm an ENFJ, 911, social sexual in the Enneagram. I'm a life, personal development, and relationship coach. So I really do enjoy anything that has to do with interpersonal dynamics. I love to explore all different sorts of topics like religion, philosophy, personality psychology, psychology in general, spiritual aspects of life, and yeah, just anything esoteric too. So yeah, I really enjoy all of that. And seeing what else would be relevant. Probably I'll leave it at that. I'm looking forward to this part 2 because last week we did kind of like nail a lot on how these functions can show up in a bad way. But there's also ways where they can be integrated, just like the inferior function. It's not a function that's like, always going to be actually, like something that's getting you into trouble, but it can be integrated even if it's not necessarily being developed. And I think that one of the differences between developed and integrated is more like when you're integrating a function, you're kind of creating space for it to be able to be used and to be able to do what it has to do without you like intentionally trying to like build it up. So like if you're developing a function as a coach, and of course I'm not here to tell any of you guys actually like what to do and what not to do. If you want to go and try to develop your shadow functions, then go ahead, obviously. Granted, I do think that from what we know about them, it's better to just integrate them, as in like creating good space for them, and focus more on like developing like your primary functions, such as your dominant and your auxiliary, maybe your tertiary, developing that. But I think that tertiary downwards is more about integrating, because usually when you have your dominant and your auxiliary really well developed and you've integrated the other two, then everything else seems to kind of like fall into place. So that being said, though, last week we did talk a lot about when these shadow functions are not, or the opposing slash mercenary function is not really integrated. And so this week we are going to be talking about like what it looks like if you actually do have a integrated or healthy relationship with it.
Thank you, Denzel. So yeah, if you are new to the channel and you are wanting to get profiled by Denzel, at the end of the stream, we can talk a little bit about that. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides on the opposing role. If you are new to this channel and you don't know anything about the opposing role and you're like, what is this? That's totally okay. You can actually go to my YouTube channel in the lives section and you can see the first part of the stream where we'll introduce you to the basics of the opposing role. We just didn't feel like we got into it enough last week and there were a lot more questions. So we wanted to have a part 2 so that we weren't just skimming the surface of this function. So this is the 5th function in your stack. If you look at this, this is how you'll commonly see the function stack online when you look online. This is an ESFP cognitive function stack. And as you can see, there's the dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. These are your 4 primary functions. The opposing role would be the 5th function. It's not shown here. This would be further into your unconscious. And so let's move on to the next slide. This will show you the function stack of your shadow functions. So the shadow functions are part of John Beebe's 8-function model. So John Beebe has his function stack laid out a little differently than what you'd see over here. John Beebe's 8-function stack looks like this. You have the spine of your personality, which is the vertical line going down the middle, and that's composed of your hero function, the dominant function, and then your animus, which is your inferior function. And then you have the arms of your personality, which would be the mother, father, and the eternal child. So this is the primary function stack as is laid out by John Beebe. If you don't know who John Beebe is, he is a psychotherapist, very accomplished author, and also someone who's been studying type for I don't know how many decades, a long time. But he's I think he's headed the he's a Jungian analyst. He's worked with all the big typologists out there, but he's also used type as a psychologist for many, many years. And then here you can see the shadow function. The opposing role, here we're looking at ESFP. You can see the dominant function for ESFP is extroverted sensing. The opposing role is introverted sensing. So whatever your dominant function is, if you change the attitude of that, you'll get your opposing role. So if you are an ESFJ and you have dominant extroverted feeling, then your opposing role would be introverted feeling. Or if you're an INFP and you have dominant introverted feeling, your opposing role would be extroverted feeling. So if you have any questions about that, be sure to let us know. Hi, Tiara. Hi, Tor. Hey, Umesh. Cody, thank you so much for being here. All right. So the opposing role, like all the function placements, the opposing role creates a tension of opposites that creates balance for your personality type. We need that tension. Without it, we would be really, really warped. If you can imagine, let's just take an introverted intuitive, for example. If you have an introverted intuitive who's really, really warped and they're totally focused on their intuitive vision and they're blocking out all the other possibilities, that would be a warped personality. Dominant introverted intuition needs the opposing role of extroverted intuition to make sure that introverted intuition isn't going off the rails. Development of the hero function, which is the same as the dominant function, by nature involves some development and differentiation of the opposing role. So if you were sorting out as a visual, if you're sorting out laundry and you're like, okay, I need to take out and sort out all the green clothes, and you sort them all out from all the rest, and you're like, well, I really like this shade of green more than the dark green more than light green. You will still become more aware of green in general. Maybe that's not the best example, but in the same way as you're developing intuition, if you're a dominant introverted intuitive type, in the process of developing introverted intuition, there will be some development of extroverted intuition, your opposing role, simultaneously. It just won't be as conscious to you. It won't be something you associate as part of yourself as well. So here's what's important about the shadow functions. They provide balance. We talked about that. They give us a sense of humility. When we become aware of the shadow functions and the areas in our life that we're less conscious of, we in turn gain more humility because we realize, oh, I don't have it all figured out. There are parts of my life that I need to work on, or there are things that other people do better. When we don't have this awareness, we can start thinking we are the master of the universe, or we have all the answers, and other people's way of doing things is just wrong rather than different. The shadow functions keep us from over-relying on egosyntonic functions and becoming warped, just like we talked about that, what was I talking about? How you're developing, it keeps your egosyntonic functions are your top 4 functions. And even though they're very important and they're the ones you should put the most conscious energy into developing, they also can lead us off the rails. They can become imbalanced at times. And so the shadow functions, again, create that tension of opposites where they balance our perspectives and keep them from being too one-sided. The shadow functions also serve to protect the ego from attacks from others. So we talked a little bit about that last week, how the opposing role can protect the dominant function from attacks from others. And when differentiated, when integrated, they give us more self-awareness and wisdom. So Mark Hunziker says, the shadow function attitude archetypes serve to defend the self against external attacks and internal imbalance. Now I'm going to ask Denzel if he has any thoughts so far on what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that Susan, you've pretty much covered all of it. But essentially, we already talked a lot about this last week too. So like if you guys haven't seen that, definitely check that out. But I really do like the idea of the ego syntonic versus ego dystonic. So when we're talking about the shadow in general, when we're talking about like Jung, when he talked about the shadow, it's essentially the parts of us that we don't really identify with, the parts of us that we are ashamed of, the parts of us that we kind of like try to suppress, that we try to like close a blind eye to, or we're aware of, but then we try to like hide it from other people. And anytime that we essentially are saying like, that wasn't me, or that's like not me, or that like, you don't like, I don't relate to that, like that, but you've acted in that kind of way or something, then that clearly is you. Like it's a part of you. Because if it literally wasn't you, then it wouldn't have been able to come out. The only thing is, it's maybe like a lesser part of you or a part of you that's in the shadow, that's like more hidden. This isn't to say that the shadow defines who you are, but it's important for you to understand what your shadow is like telling you, and also not really hide from it, because then you're able to not necessarily control it, but when you bring the shadow into the light, then you're able to identify with it, and then you're able to like, okay, this is something that is within me. It doesn't define who I am, but it is an aspect of who I am, and therefore, I acknowledge it, I accept it, and a lot of times you don't really have to do much about it. The shadow is not necessarily something that you're trying to rid of or trying to destroy, but it's really just something more of like trying to be aware of and accept within yourself. So you're also not trying to capitalize on it. Like for those of us who've watched the last episode, I won't say too much for in case if you haven't seen like the last season, but like the latest few episodes of the last season, like where Joe was pretty much integrating his shadow, or he kind of did a little bit too much of that. Like there's a point where it's like it's integration versus like, okay, now I'm allowing this to like just take over everything. And that's where it's like, okay, now you're becoming like imbalanced. So there's a reason why like we have like an ego and then a shadow. And so us talking about the shadow functions, I love that Susan has like everything like, bullet pointed and everything, because these are a lot harder to identify in people at times. And it's very archetypal instead. So a lot of the examples and everything that we might state, it might be a little bit harder to grasp, simply because, again, like it's shadow aspects. So it's the parts of these types that we might not see as frequently. And so it's harder to kind of like pattern it. And it's more of like coming out in just an archetypal sense. And especially when we're talking about integrated shadows, then it's like, well, not many people usually integrate their shadow functions or even integrate their shadow self. So those are the comments or disclaimers I guess I'll make with that.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, a lot of times we don't see the shadow in people unless we get really close to them. Like a lot of times we're drawn to people who are different than us at the beginning, and then like as we have a longer and longer relationship, we start to see sides of them that we're not so sure about. And people have to get really comfortable with another person usually before we can really see that shadow coming into play. That said, if you are with someone in their comfort zone and they're you even don't know them very well, but they're in their comfort zone, you might see bits of their shadow. I often see this when I'm entering families. I don't know if you've seen this, Denzel, where certain families have an egocentric culture. For example, like they're all SJs, as an example. And so you'll see shadow as extroverted sensing or shadow introverted intuition coming up. And it's at part of the family's culture to perceive these functions in this negative way or to project those functions in a negative way. Anyway, that's part of a bigger conversation maybe. But yeah, you typically aren't going to see the shadow functions in people right away when you meet them. Typically, you're going to see their more egocentric functions, just as Denzel was saying. All right, so the importance of the opposing role. Last week, we talked a lot about the negative ways that this can show up. The main purpose of the opposing role is to keep the hero, your dominant function, from getting carried away and inflated. As the dominant function, hero, becomes more and more inflated, the opposing role will create a tension that pulls it toward the restoration of balance. It will operate as a voice in the background of our consciousness that influences us to make minor course corrections, pulling us towards wholeness and balance. development of this function or integration of this function does require self-esteem and self-forgiveness. If you are like wrecked emotionally, this is not the time to be like, oh, let me go ahead and work on my opposing role. Like, absolutely not. If you're in a really bad place, just try to take care of your dominant and auxiliary function. Try to take care of yourself. But because the fact that is once you start becoming conscious of your opposing role, you will start to see ways in which you have failed in the past, mistakes you have made in perception, mistakes you have made in judgment, and it can be a difficult and rocky road. So you have to be able to forgive yourself for past mistakes, and you also have to have the inner self-esteem or the inner strength to handle that kind of probing into yourself. But it is important. And just like you have 10 fingers, but I'm not frequently using my left pinky finger for much of anything. We use all the 8 functions. We just may not realize consciously how we're using them day to day, moment to moment. So there are weaknesses of the opposing role. We talked about that last week, but I just wanted to give a really brief overview this week because I think it's important to remember. They can cause us to make unfair or inaccurate. The opposing role can cause us to make unfair or inaccurate projections onto others. Because we interpret this role as oppositional, we tend to see other people using this role. We can see what they're doing as oppositional, even when it's not intended to be. So if you are, say, an extroverted thinking dominant type, an ESTJ, you might see INTPs or ISTPs as oppositional sometimes. You might misinterpret what they're doing when they're expressing introverted thinking as oppositional. That's one way that you can project that onto others. They can cause us to become needlessly or childishly oppositional and defensive, doing things our own way. So we have our own way that we think everything should be done, and typically that revolves around our dominant function. So if you are an introverted feeling dominant type, you think everything should be handled by introverted feeling. That's the right hammer for all the nails. It's the right boss for every workforce. Everything should be about subjective internal values and making sure everyone is in alignment with their core ethics, and that would be the focus. So you might see, talking today is a hardship. So extroverted feeling at times may seem oppositional to you because it's more about considering the group's values and things like that. But when you oppose people via extroverted feeling, your opposing role, you can seem unnecessarily childish or inappropriate even, things like that. Not always, but often. That's one of the weaknesses of the opposing roles, that when we're in its energy, before we integrate it, we tend to use it in a childish way, or we tend to use it in a way that doesn't seem, that can seem a little bit inappropriate or odd to people who are watching. The opposing role can be the source of behaviors we don't own up to, behaviors we deny doing, but others have noticed us doing. So a lot of hypocrisy and passive aggressiveness can be tied to the shadow functions. We may limit or oppose others who are using this function, even if they are using it in an egocentric or healthy way. We may appear uncouth, inappropriate, or childish when using this function. I guess I already went into that one. So these are some of the weaknesses of that function. But that doesn't mean, even though those weaknesses are there, it doesn't mean we should just do away with it. It doesn't mean it's a bad function. It still has a lot of good to bring to the table, as we talked about. Before we go on to how this function shows up for each type, Denzel, did you have any more thoughts you wanted to share?
I think I had one thought, but I lost it now. It probably wasn't that important, though. It's good.
That tends to happen to me on these live streams because I don't do well spontaneously blurting out my thoughts. I'll get something and then I'm listening to you and then I'll lose it.
Yeah, it happens, but it's all good, though. If it was meant to be said, then it would be said.
Well, if it comes back to you, definitely raise your hand or let us know in some way because I'm sure it was a valuable one.
Gotcha.
And then Umesh has good input. She says emotional safety versus financial safety critical to each other. I think maybe what you're talking about is, the importance of emotional safety when it comes to exploring the opposing role or exploring the shadow functions. Feeling emotionally safe enough to, if you're with someone else, to talk about them is important. Feeling emotionally strong enough to process them and to understand it in yourself is also important. So let's talk about oppositional introverted intuition. This would be the opposing role for ENTPs and ENFPs. These are the benefits of integrating introverted intuition for ENTPs and ENFPs. And also, I want to say before I continue, there's a really good book about the importance of integrating this function, and it's called The Magic Diamond, and it's by Dario Nardi. And he gives profiles of each of the 16 personality types. And within those profiles, he talks about how important it is to integrate the fifth function. So some of the information I'm mentioning here is information that I found throughout his book. So these are the benefits for ENTPs and ENFPs. When they use NI, introverted intuition, they gain more focus. They can grasp more profound insights. They can predict future trends and patterns more accurately. They become more trusting of their unconscious to guide them forward. And they harness their extroverted intuition to landing on one idea or vision to focus on wholeheartedly. So extroverted intuition tends to focus on multiple possibilities, and it's constantly generating more and more and more ideas. But when they are able to integrate the oppositional role, the fifth function, they become more focused. They're able to maybe select one idea and really see which one is going to be the most viable long term, rather than playing around with a bunch of ideas and possibly getting nowhere. Any thoughts from you, Denzel?
Nope. That's all very accurate. I think that, well, we haven't got to where it's being integrated yet, right?
No, this would be the benefits of integrating introverted intuition for ENPs.
Okay, so with this, then I actually see this as like, for each of these functions, it's covering all of the ground of that function. So if you're one-sided in intuition, which, again, like we are going to be predominantly more in tune with one side, because that one side is going to be in our ego functions versus our shadow functions. But if you're really trying to integrate the shadow functions, then you're pretty much trying to, again, like hold space for the other side. So as an ENTP or ENFP, you're not necessarily trying to become like a master at introverted intuition. Again, if you might even already believe that you are, I'm not here to say that you're not. But, theoretically, like that's not something that you are trying to become a master in. But rather you're trying to integrate it. You're trying to create space for it. You're going to have a lot of moments where you do, because we still do use all 8 functions. So you're going to be having moments where, oh, like this was an NI insight, or like I used NI in this way, etc. But there is a time where, yeah, you have to land the plane. So there's a tendency for extroverted intuition to, the way that I see it, and this is not bad, so I want to put this out there. The way that I see it, it's kind of like, if introverted intuition, like if they're both like on a plane, introverted intuition is looking for X marks the spot. And then once introverted intuition finds X marks the spot, then the fun comes with introverted intuition trying to dig into that X, because now it's like, okay, I'm getting closer to what actually is. But with extroverted intuition, then it's like, wait, no. There could be other X's out there. And so let's keep on like looking around for more X's. And it's not even really trying to land the plane on the X marks the spot. It's actually trying to see how many X's there might be, rather than digging into the X itself, because then it's more fun. It's more like once they land on the X, then it's like, now the fun is over. Now we have to dig. And that's not really what extroverted intuition wants to do when it's purely extroverted intuition. Now, once again, everybody uses all 8 functions. So there are going to be ENTPs and ENFPs out there who are like, well, like I like to dig, and sometimes somebody could also say like, well, is this your TI or FI that you're actually digging into? Because like that's a different kind of aspect. But yes, there are the ENTPs and ENFPs who will dig into that introverted intuition aspect of things. And that's when you're like actually showing like an integrated version of that introverted intuition, rather than just like trying to keep that plane up in the air for as long as you can because it's more fun. And then, I think that the flip side, this will come back up again once we get to the INJ types, and how it's the same analogy, but it's like, okay, maybe there is also benefit in not just always trying to land the plane on an X, but trying to actually like find like, hey, like maybe there's another X out there, because then that's how you can get a lot of INJs who might become like very closed-minded with like, this is the one way to go about things.
I love that metaphor, Denzel. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so let's talk about the the flip side of this. Opposing role extroverted intuition for INFJs and INTJs. So just like Denzel was saying, INFJs and INTJs are looking for the one place to land, essentially, the one vision that will guide them. And so they tend to be very single-minded. And if they're not careful, if they're getting too focused on the single vision or this one prediction or this one pattern, they can develop tunnel vision, and they miss out on other possibilities and alternatives. And that's never a good thing. So when oppositional extrovert intuition is integrated, it can keep them from developing that tunnel vision. It can keep them from missing key possibilities. And it can encourage them to be more open-minded. INFJs and INTJs that have not integrated extroverted intuition can often seem difficult, very stubborn, like difficult to persuade of anything. If they have a plan or if they have a vision or an insight, if you bring up an alternative to them, they can very quickly become oppositional with you. And that's where their oppositional extrovert intuition can come into play. And so when they've integrated extrovert intuition, which means being aware of it, conscious of it, and giving it some space, like letting that little voice, like we talked about, the little voice in your unconscious actually be heard, then they're more open to other possibilities and alternatives. They're more open-minded. Their imagination in turn becomes broader because they can imagine more. They're not so focused on one thing to imagine and one vision. They can play with other possibilities, and the world of their imagination has more scope. They also become more patient. I can say for certain that INJs who are one-sided, their dominant function is inflated, they can be very impatient with anything that's getting in the way of their course. And so when they integrate extroverted intuition, they do have more patience for interruptions, for other ideas, and things that might be leading them slightly off course, but maybe they need to be for a little while. They also will embrace the randomness, the inherent randomness of life. When their plan doesn't go their way, they can laugh at it more easily rather than just exploding and throwing all their plans in a heap on the floor. Like, they're able to embrace the unpredictability of life better when they have integrated extroverted intuition. So Denzel, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like just to hopefully this doesn't get like too convoluted and messy, but one of the inherent things of NI and SE, because they're always a coin or a polarity, is that it's all about timing. So it's kind of like NI and SE, they're kind of like, okay, like I have to catch that train, like, or else all of my, future is going to mess up or whatever it might be. Like, it's very like that one, like this timing, like it's kind of like a constant waiting to just jump right in. Whereas extroverted intuition, introverted sensing is more of like, oh, there's possibilities everywhere. And so we don't have to focus as much on timing. And there's no right or wrong answer because everything is more of like situational. Sometimes the extroverted intuition kind of like creates the opportunities, whereas like because the introverted intuition is so focused on that one train, and then if it misses it, then it's like, oh no, and it's like crying, and other trains are passing by or it's not even looking at the other areas or considering there's other areas where there could be other trains and stuff. So with that said, when the NI DOM actually allows and integrates space for other trains or like other possibilities and stuff like that, just like what Susan said, they do become a lot more like patient. They do become a lot more like even happier in general because they embrace optimism in a way, and they start to actually allow like more things to come into their life that can then sharpen their NI to then find better paths. Because the extroverted intuition is kind of like the, hey, have you seen this yet? And introverted intuition looks over and it's like, I guess I haven't been there yet. Okay, and introverted intuition is the one who can go further down there, but if extroverted intuition doesn't uncover these different rabbit holes for introverted intuition to go down into, then it's not going to be able to have these rabbit holes to go down into. It's just going to keep on drilling deeper and deeper and deeper into one hole. And that's a very limited aspect. So, in order to be truly like well rounded in the realm of intuition, then yeah, an introverted intuitive dominant would want to integrate that extroverted intuition. Again, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that you try to become a master of extroverted intuition and like have all of these possibilities all the time and like looking for all of the different X's, because that again is not really like your forte, or how your mind is naturally wired. If you want to do it, you can. Like everything, if you want to, sure you can, but you're gonna have a harder time with that naturally. But if you integrate or you make space for it, then that's really going to help you to be able to cover more of the ground and get more quality insights.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Denzel. I think when it comes to your shadow functions, yeah, don't try to become like an ex. Well, okay, like Denzel said, try if you want to, but it's probably going to be a little distressing to try to become like an expert at extroverted intuition or any opposing role function. Um, but that doesn't mean you never use it well either. There are going to be times where you do use it well, and it what most of what I hear suggested the most is to use if you want to play with this function, if you want to integrate it, the best thing to do is to play with it in a relaxed, healthy, create like silly, playful, no pressure way. So if you're an INJ and you want to get into extrovert intuition, pick a time when you don't have anything going on, you're not stressed, you're feeling good about yourself, life's, pretty calm. And that could be a time where maybe you sit down and with somebody you enjoy and you brainstorm solutions to a problem. Or maybe you watch some crazy off the wall movie like Everywhere, Everything, All at Once, which everyone I know loves and I absolutely hate because it's way too much extroverted intuition for me. Like I just found the whole movie like completely like overwhelming. But but if you're like in a really relaxed place and you feel mentally freed up, you could do something like that. There are ways to integrate extrovert intuition that don't feel really overwhelming. But if you're trying to integrate any shadow function, try to do it when you're in a good space, when you're feeling good about yourself, when you're fairly calm, and don't do it for like hours and hours and hours and hours. Just like give yourself little spurts of that. Maybe you're, married to someone who has your oppositional role as their dominant. Maybe it could mean in that situation, listening to what they have to say and trying to really hear it with an open mind without thinking about all the ways that your perspective is better. Because that is something that you can run a risk of. If you're, say, an ENFP and you're married to an INTJ, you can both be doing that to each other all the time, thinking to yourselves, if he only used extrovert intuition here, it would be so much better than what he's doing with introverted intuition, and they're thinking the same thing about you. So you could integrate your oppositional role by just making space for your partner to express themselves and trying as hard as possible to have an open mind about what they have to say.
Yeah, I was just also gonna throw in two things. First and foremost, that movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. That's it's so funny that you say that as an INTJ. I feel like I watched the movie twice so far. The first time I watched it, it was with all NI users. So I had ISFP, another ISFP, and ISTP.
Tertiary NI users.
Yeah,
Okay.
tertiary NI. But
Yeah.
they can keep up. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Like don't let us fool you. But I just remember the movie ended and they were like, "What the was that?" And there's like there was no point to it and everything. Like they much more appreciated a movie such as Inception. Like we all watched Inception and we talked about that like for hours. But then Everything Everywhere All at Once, it was like, ugh. And I just hear all the time like how much a lot of NPs love that movie. And I can see the appreciation for it and everything. But yeah, there was a lot of like times where like I watched it, I'm like, but I think that the thing about NI is it's a very serious function. And so NE kind of like reminds it to live a little, like to be a little bit funny. Like I like Albert Camus' philosophy on absurdism. And I think that Albert Camus was an NE dominant. And I feel like his idea of just like, yeah, life is just absurd, and, just kind of like, like accept that in a way. For NI users, like, no, but there's meaning to this. And even if there isn't, like, we have to impose meaning, and it's like we make things more serious. But when you integrate that NE, that's just kind of like derp and like more like crackhead energy, if you will, then the NI cracks the smile and it starts to like let go of not all of the seriousness, because we do need that seriousness. Just like with NE DOMs, like they need some seriousness too, or else, a lot of this stuff, like it's not gonna, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Like we need both. But yeah, essentially with the NI, then that's kind of like what you need. And I like I said, the opposing role, I like to see it as a mercenary type of archetype. The function that pretty much is like whatever your dominant function is saying, oh my gosh, I would never do that, I could never. Then your opposing role / mercenary function is like, oh, that's exactly what I do. And they both want to accomplish the same thing, but they're coming at it from different angles. And so once you integrate them, instead of them kind of like like bickering about the right way to do it, it's almost like they're back to back. And those like movies where it's like it's kind of like they're back to back with the guns and they're like shooting, and then the camera's like rolling around them. That's pretty much like the epitome of, okay, now you're covering all bases in that realm. And I think that that's where that's like a good analogy for the opposing role and the hero function to be like now working together in a way. And then the mercenary, he's like, all right, I got the job done, I got the coin. He goes back to his shadowy cave until he's summoned again. Or she.
I like that example, Denzel. You always have the best metaphors. All right. So, and I agree. I think when you have your oppositional role integrated, then it makes the hero better. Anytime you integrate any function, it makes your dominant function better. It just makes you overall a healthier person. So now let's move on to oppositional introverted sensing. This is the oppositional role for ESTPs and ESFPs. So ESTPs and ESFPs really like to live life by the seat of their pants. Like they enjoy being spontaneous. They enjoy adapting to life as it happens rather than having a strict plan or a steady routine. And so they can see introverted sensing types as a little bit maybe stuck in their ways as they create these really consistent routines and they are always searching for stability. But when ESTPs and ESFPs integrate introverted sensing, it can keep them from making really hasty mistakes. One of the issues that extroverted sensing dominant types can have is that they leap before they look, and then they break a leg or something like that, but not in a good way. So when they integrate introverted sensing, they can become more conscious of the risks. They can be more cautious, and they can also become more reliable. Rather than switching their plans day to day based on what feels good in the moment, they can think about the traditions, the legacy they want to leave, the routines that are going to give them what they really ultimately want. They also become more consistent in their good habits, although if they integrate their oppositional role in a negative way, they can also become more consistent in their bad habits. And they can take matters of security and stability more seriously and see meaning and beauty in preserving traditions and moments that they love. So it's a bit confusing sometimes as we talk about integrating the oppositional role, because some of these same effects can happen when you integrate the inferior function. So multiple functions can have the same effect. For example, an ESTP who's really spontaneous and out of control, if he integrates his auxiliary introverted thinking, that can help him also to avoid making hasty mistakes because he's being more logical about things. But in the same way,
I would clarify and say that would be more for the auxiliary. It's more developing, I would say, whereas like the inferior and below is like more like integrating. But yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Anal.
Why are you being critical introverted thinking with me, Denzel? I'm so mad at you now. No. What Denzel said is right. So if you're going to develop introverted thinking as an ESTP or develop introverted feeling as an ESFP, then you're going to have some of these same effects. You're not going to make as hasty mistakes, and you're going to be less impulsive and flying by the seat of your pants. But Integrating introverted sensing as your oppositional role can also have this similar effect. When you're overboard on extroverted sensing and you're not integrating introverted sensing or listening to that little voice, it's like, well, maybe you should actually brush your teeth at the same time every single day, because when you do it at this other time, you tend to forget. Or maybe, it would be a good idea to always check that everyone has their, seatbelt buckled the right way before you go on this, crazy drive, or whatever it is. It's introverted sensing is always looking for the little details that need to be consistent and the things that it can rely on based on past experience. So when extroverted sensing types start doing that, when they start looking to the past and thinking to themselves, maybe when I do this thing, when I've done this repeated activity in the past, it's turned out bad for me. So maybe let me stop, collect my memories from the past, and course correct. It will work better for me. That's a good integration of introverted sensing into their way of observing and reacting to life as it happens. Denzel, any thoughts from you on that?
I think that you nailed it. Yeah, that's all great. And I guess yeah, just there is some, it gets a little bit muddy because again, humans are complicated and cognitive functions are very abstract and conceptual. So it's like they will kind of bleed into each other. That's why we have polarities, and that's why we have like these shadow functions and stuff like that. Like the same way that FE and TI always come together, but then even though they're like two sides of the same coin, then there's also like, okay, but then FE has an aspect of FI that it's also tethered to, but then FI is tethered to TE, and then TE also has an aspect of TI that it's tethered to. And so this kind of can get really like muddy, just like what Susan said. And so we are really like trying to explain these things in their most purest form. And that can be like pretty difficult. And I'm saying this again, like as a disclaimer for like people who might be like, well, I can do that and this is that. But like, again, like if we're just explaining the concept as it is so that we can help you understand it, like that's our way of like distinguishing that. So with that, yes, as an ESFP, you integrate that introverted intuition function, which is the inferior function. And that helps a lot with continuing to ground that extroverted sensing, which also comes through the integration of that auxiliary or the development of that auxiliary function. But then when you get to that fifth function, then introverted sensing has a territory that's separate from introverted intuition. So when we're talking about integrating that, it is going to be different than when an ESFP or ESTP is integrating introverted intuition, because NI and SI are covering different ground. And so, yeah, as we talk about this fifth function and, integrating it and stuff like that, just know that there is going to be like some kind of like a little bit of like muddiness where it's like, oh, well, that kind of sounds similar to integrating the inferior function. But if you think of like each of the 8 functions having their own terrain, and like a place where they kind of like rule, again, conceptually and theoretically, like if you don't have FE in your top ego stack, that doesn't mean that you suck at relationships. And if you don't have FI, that doesn't mean that you can't feel your feelings like at all. It's just, like conceptually, this is how it is. But seeing like that they all like have like a monopoly, loosely said, on certain terrain helps you to better understand like what's working on what. And then you can integrate all of them so that you can have the space for each slice of life.
Thank you, Denzel. And I completely agree with you. Yeah, as we talking about the shadow functions, there really isn't a lot of material that's been developed about the shadow functions. There's literally 2 books that I've ever read that I've been able to find that really go into the shadow functions, and they don't even lay out a really like, here's the bullet points, like I'm trying to do here. My extroverted thinking is trying to do in these slides. So there are a lot of things that can, keep ESTPs and ESFPs from making mistakes. But the way oppositional introverted sensing keeps ESTPs and ESFPs from making mistakes is specifically to remind them of what's worked or hasn't worked in the past. And it's also to have them pay closer attention to the details and how they might impact them. So an example could be, I had an example earlier and now it just paraded out of my brain. But just being more careful and looking before you leap versus leaping before you look. The introverted sensing type is definitely going to look before they leap. They want to know what's going to happen before they take action, whereas the extroverted sensing type tends to want to take action and figure it out as they go. So as they integrate introverted sensing, they're more likely to look a little bit before they leap and avoid unnecessary complications or problems down the road. We have a question from Uma. She says, or he, I'm not sure gender, to integrate shadow functions, how important is it to understand and be self-aware of our actions, speech, and thought? Personally, I think it's always important to be aware of those things. When we are integrating it, especially when we're dealing with others, it's really good to be conscious of how we're speaking and how we're acting, because it can be very easy when we're integrating it, for it to become argumentative and oppositional and projecting, and for you to use it in a negative or retaliatory way, or like fighting and things like that. And so if you become conscious of, how am I using this function? How is it turning into something good or bad? And how can I keep myself, in a good space? So we talked before about how important it is, if you're trying to integrate your shadow functions, to be in a really healthy, calm, stress-free space. But if, as you're integrating it, you start feeling yourself get more and more tense, maybe more defensive, more oppositional, more argumentative and stressed, that's probably a sign that you need to back off a little bit. You can still let whoever you're with be themselves, but maybe you need to give yourself a break from trying to integrate that at that moment. And also, before you say something maybe you don't mean, or you end up, getting in your own way in the process. Denzel, I don't know if you have any thoughts on her question.
Yeah, I think that's really well explained. Like, the easiest way to get access to your shadow is to be triggered. So the more that you're triggered, like the more easily that you're triggered by things, according to Jung, then the more shadow content that you have to deal with. So like those types of people who are like very rarely triggered, it's not that, they're like perfect and they've, made it to like aha or whatever, but that means that they've really made peace with their shadow. They've really integrated their shadow. And it doesn't also mean that they can never be triggered, but it just happens a lot less. So if somebody's trying to integrate shadow functions, start seeing like how you're getting triggered with certain functions and certain things in general. And when you do get triggered, immediately take my NISE is like coming in, like take advantage immediately. But yeah, but like immediately like jump in through that doorway of like, oh shoot, like I'm triggered. Wait, hold on, let me pause. Why am I triggered about that? I wonder what that's like pointing to. What in my shadow is like coming from that? And then if we're looking at this archetypally, then it's like, okay, like is this coming from my mercenary / opposing role? And like, what is my relationship with that function? And like, why is that this? And then, you really start to integrate it. And then it's almost like you're getting your hero and your mercenary / opposing role to shake hands. It's like, okay, we don't have to be the best of friends, but we can have a respect for each other. Versus, we're both trying to accomplish the same thing, but I'm so sure that I can do it my way kind of thing. They're always like fighting with each other. So it is important to understand and be self-aware of your actions, speech, and thought, because that's what's going to open the doorway for you to be able to actually integrate the content that you're looking for.
Thank you, Denzel. That was an amazing answer. And one thing that's important is what he said exactly, is pay attention to what you're triggered to. But there's something to remember. Whenever we're angry, and this is psychologists know about this, when we're angry, we're more likely to believe that we're right than when we're calm or not angry. So the angrier you get, the more certain you are that you're right about something. So if you find that you're triggered, especially if it has relating to your shadow functions, when you retaliate with your shadow, you're very likely to believe that you are in the right, the other person is wrong. And so as you're projecting, let's say the oppositional role, you're saying, oh, that other person is opposing me and they're just getting in my way. You tend to believe 110% that you are correct in that assessment. And then it's only later, when everything's calm, you become more rational, that you go, maybe I don't want to think about how I acted in that moment, because I don't want to associate, you never want to associate the shadow as part of yourself. So those are the times we try to kind of just like sweep under the rug and not recall or not have anyone remind us of. And if someone does remind us of a time when we were in our shadow, we tend to get really defensive really fast and maybe get triggered back into the shadow again, or be like, oh, that really wasn't that big of a deal, because we don't want to associate it with ourselves. So pay attention to when you're triggered, but then also take some time to focus on calming your body. If you really want to learn about why you're triggered and to be open-minded to what's going on there, you have to get yourself into a more physically calm space in the process. So if you notice that you're triggered, like definitely do some breathing, deep breathing, take some space away from whatever's triggering you for a minute. And then when you're in a calmer space, you can then analyze, why did that make me angry? Why did I feel oppositional about that thing? Maybe it's about my oppositional role was triggered. Did I feel critical and like I needed to like restrict and criticize that thing? Well, maybe my sixth function was triggered. And think about what kind of energy did you feel when you were triggered. But sometimes doing it in the heat of the moment, you're just going to believe that whatever you feel is probably right. So
that was a beautiful answer. I'm glad that you added that. Fully agree.
Thank you. Yeah, I know it's like hard because like when you're angry, you don't want to think that you're wrong. Like I know when I'm angry, I just want to feel like I'm right, and I know I'm right. But there's also, when I learned that fact, I always have this voice like, remember what the book said.
That's why I, as a 9, try to keep from being angry.
That's often the best way to handle things. All right, so now let's move on to extroverted sensing in ISFJs and ISTJs. Also, I just want to say, because I know we're getting closer to 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. Eastern, if you have a question, don't feel like you have to wait till the end of the stream. Feel free to ask it at any time. Once we get to a pause, we will answer your question. We want to hear any thoughts that you have as we're going. So ISFJs and ISTJs have dominant introverted sensing. This function is one that it pays attention to details and memories and lessons from the past and integrates those into the present so that there's more stability, more a sense of routine, and more sense of predictability. And so introverted sensing types often have special routines. They often have special traditions that give them a sense that they're grounded in reality, that life is calm and manageable. So extroverted sensing, which is more about flying by the seat of your pants, can feel very oppositional to them. It can feel like a threat to their stability. So integrating it can be difficult. But when they do, integrating SE, extroverted sensing, for an ISJ can mean trying new things, taking certain risks, safe risks. Like you're at a restaurant and you always get, I don't know, eggs Benedict, but this time you're like, I'm going to risk it and I'm going to try like the waffle, or it can mean trusting your instincts more. ISJs can sometimes get stuck in over questioning the, safety or stability of something and not trusting their internal instincts. So when they integrate extroverted sensing, they can have more of a sense of, oh, let me just try it. Let me just try this new experience and see what happens. Integrating extroverted sensing can help them to adapt to what's happening in the moment. It can encourage them to try new things. It can help them to feel freer and less bound by traditions and their routine. It can help them to enjoy a wider range of activities, and it can help them not to get stuck in traditions or routines that aren't serving them. Denzel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, when the SI dominant embraces more experiences, both in the NE realm, which will be their inferior function, and the fifth function, which is SE, then these are when you have the most open-minded SI DOMs, which we don't really associate SI DOMs with open-mindedness that much. But when they've really like integrated those two functions, then they're really allowing for a lot of experiences to come in, because these are the SI DOMs that realize that everything that has become their SI was once upon a time NE or SE. And so in order to really like get to that point, it's like, okay, I have to be open to these new experiences. And that's the wisdom of SI. Like, oh, I've come this far. I've understood this far. So I need to continue to embrace more of the SE in the world. That's going to later be transmutated to SI after the experience is over with. And I'm going to be grateful that I've added more to my SI repertoire.
Thank you, Denzel. I'm glad you brought that up. What you said about SE becoming SI. If you're new to cognitive functions, what he's essentially saying, and I'm not trying to like explain this because you did a perfectly good job explaining it, but just as an example, it could be like, say you like going to Disney World. I'll just use that as an example because I like Disney World. But you're like, I only like to go on these few rides. I don't want to try, I don't know, Splash Mountain because I've never tried that and that drop looks really scary. But I'm just going to do like these other few rides over and over and over again. And this other, maybe your extroverted sensing friend is like, come on, you'll really like it. And you're like, no, I'm not going to do it. That when you integrate extroverted sensing, it could be as simple as being like, okay, fine, I'll try this new thing. Let me do it. And then the next time you go, now you have to do it because you did it before and it was fun. And now it is an introverted sensing thing that you keep doing again and again and again, because now you've accumulated that into your learned experience that you want to keep repeating. All right, so let's move on then to integrating introverted feeling for ENFJs and ESFJs. So ENFJs and ESFJs, as Denzel could probably explain much better, they are very aware of how other people are feeling, about group values, the needs and desires of the people around them, the greater good, essentially. When they integrate introverted feeling, they become more conscious of who they are outside of what everyone else expects them to be, outside of what everyone else wants. So extroverted feeling, when it becomes overinflated, can become very people-pleasing, very codependent, very so focused on what everyone else needs that they lose themselves in the process. So integrating introverted feeling can be as simple as stopping when someone asks you to do something and thinking, do I really want to do this right now? Like, is this what I actually want? And maybe being able to say, no, sorry, not right now. That can be one way that EFJs can integrate it, because if they don't, sometimes they just say yes to everything because they just want to make everyone happy. And then they end up at, 10 years down the road thinking, I didn't do anything I actually wanted to do. I mean, even if they got some satisfaction from helping and nurturing others, they might have become kind of dim to who they are in the process. So when they integrate introverted feeling, they get more in touch with their personal identity. They allow others to have more room to live according to their own values. So imbalanced extroverted feeling tends to think that everyone needs to operate in the same way to some degree. Like, we all need to get along. So if someone's rocking the boat because they don't have the same values, that can be a problem for an imbalanced EFJ type. But when they integrate introverted feeling, they are okay with letting other people be themselves, even if it does thereby create some tension. They have greater self-awareness. They're more comfortable saying no when it's needed, and they're more able to figure out who they are authentically, rather than who they've been told to be or who they try to be to make everyone else happy. Denzel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, that's all spot on. I think that, again, like, the first step is integrating that inferior function of TI. Like, okay, wait, I know that everybody's kind of like influenced me to believe this principle or to have this belief, but what do I think? Even if it's going to get me canceled, like, what do I logically think and why? But then from there, TI, that has its own realm, but now you're going to the fifth function of introverted feeling, just like what Susan said. It's like, okay, now what do I feel? Like, do I really feel like doing this? Do I like, what are my actual core values? No longer like just principles, but like core values, and things that I don't have to have some sort of logic to, sustain it. It's just, this is how I feel and this is why. It doesn't matter. Like, this is just innately in me. And that's the part of you that, like, literally, simply because you don't feel like it, then yeah, you don't feel like it. Or simply because you feel like it, then you feel like it. So really, like, tapping into your own, like, emotional spot in you. That way you can also keep a gauge on if you're overextending yourself, if you're doing way too much, and then all of a sudden that FI mercenary is like, bro, you're doing too much now, and now you're going to explode and rage at people. It's like, oh, I'm always doing stuff for you guys and this, that, but nobody knew that you were actually like internally like feeling some type of way because you weren't even tapped into how you were feeling about that. So it's good to like be tapped into that so that as you're still, extending yourself and everything, you have this introverted feeling almost like anchor that's keeping you from going too far outside of yourself or extending yourself too far for other people. And you can always find your way back. You can always track yourself back to that home base. And yeah, you're just keeping yourself even more centered because that'll keep you from a lot of like blow ups and a lot of passive aggressiveness and stuff of that nature because you are keeping track of your emotional temperature. And it's now no longer just, oh, how is everybody else feeling and catering to them, but it's also like, hey, I am part of everyone. So if you're catering to everyone, you are also a part of everyone. So you're including yourself in the group. You don't have to go the other extreme and be like, no, it's just me. And now you become like overly selfish. And it's like, now forget everybody else. But it's like, no, everybody else plus me rather than just everybody else and then me. So that's the proper integration there.
I love that. I'm going to use that when I'm talking to my EFJ family members. Yeah, everyone else plus me. I knew an ENFJ who really wanted to take everyone to see the Christmas lights one year, and was like, "All right, who wants to go see the Christmas lights? Let's go see them." And they were surrounded by people with introverted feeling, and they all literally all were like, "No, we're not interested." And this poor ENFJ was so devastated that like nobody wanted to go drive around and see the Christmas lights with her, but she never said, "Hey, could you guys just like, I really want to do this as a family." It was more, she posed the question as who all wants to do this rather than I would like to do this and I'd really love to do this together. Let's all go. And so sometimes for EFJs, it's literally rephrasing what you're saying is not, do you want to do this? And more, I'd really like it if we did this together. Putting yourself in the equation, which can sometimes be hard for EFJs because they're constantly thinking,
Yes.
how can I make other people get them what they need? Just making that shift to include I in the request. Like,
I
I would
think
like.
I think I will also say that's so funny though. That's because I could see myself in that. But I think also the thing for EFJs too would be um you're gauging how much other people might not want to do something. So maybe they might not have a desire, but it might not also be negative. So maybe if you were like, well, I would like for us to go do this because they're just neutral about it, then it's like, okay, well, since we know that now you want to, then sure. Like now all of a sudden I have a desire because you do, then it's like, okay. But if it's like you're trying to see, like, I think that when we feel like somebody doesn't want to do it, then we don't think of it as neutral. We think of it as just like negative. And so it's almost like even if we did it, like we could get you, well, not in a forceful way, but like we could kind of convince you to come do whatever we'd want you to do with us. But the reward of that will not be as rewarding because we do not, at least, I don't enjoy the idea of a person suffering. So if it's like, I really wants to go look at these Christmas lights or whatever, and the FI users were all like, no. And then I was like, okay, well, I would really like for us all to go. And they're like, oh, fine. And then we all go. It's still kind of like what I said about the Mafia game last week. It's still not rewarding. If anything, now it's worse. I would have rather just dealt with never going to have seen it with them and just having them still be happy and everything like that. Because that, even though it kind of sucks, it sucks more if we did all go do what I want us to do, but they weren't happy about it. Now, the ideal is we all are happy to do whatever it is that we're doing. And the second ideal is, okay, I get them to do whatever I want them to do, but then they're like, hey, Denzel, that was actually like pretty fun, which happens a lot. But if I can't foresee that happening, then it's like, okay, you know what? Let me just sacrifice whatever I feel, and we just won't do this because it's going to be even worse if you guys are like moaning and groaning, even if it's not externally, but in your head. And it's like, I don't want that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to to note for extroverted feeling types is that, okay, so I'm going to say as someone who has introverted feeling, and then I have other people in my family who have introverted feeling as well. Like what you said, we can feel neutral about something. Like if someone just asked me, I don't know, hey, would you like to, I don't know, go through a corn maze or something like that? I'd be like, I'm not really feeling a strong inclination to do that right now, like honestly. But then if someone came to me and said, hey, I think it'd be really fun, I would really enjoy going through a corn maze with you, then, well, that changes everything. It's like, oh, they want to do this with me. They're not just asking me, how do I feel about this in general? So if you're an FJ dealing with introverted feeling types, making it explicit that you specifically want that with them, it will make a big difference to them. Because otherwise, if you're just asking them what they want to do, especially if they're TJs, they'll be like, not really. This doesn't sound great to me, and they may not realize that you specifically wanted that with them. And yeah, passive aggressiveness. Okay, if you want to know about passive aggressiveness, watch the stream from last week. Because what happens with our opposing role is that when the dominant function isn't getting what it wants, the opposing role often lashes out passive aggressively. So how this can look for an FE dom or an extroverted feeling type is, hey, everyone, let's go look at the Christmas lights. Who wants to go? No one wants to go. And then it can turn into, wow, I guess nobody cares what I want to do. I guess I just have to go do this myself. And I was busy cooking for you all day, making all the Christmas food. But the minute I bring up this one thing, no one's here for me. So opposing role functions tend to do that. The dominant function didn't get what it wants. So the opposing role becomes passive aggressive in response. So that's another way to notice what your opposing role is notice what you tend to get passive aggressive around. And if you think, I never get passive aggressive, maybe you do, you just don't know it, because we don't tend to accept the things that the shadow functions do as things we did. We don't want to identify with them. So an EFJ doesn't want to identify with being passive aggressive. I've known so many EFJs who were like, not you, Denzel, but so many who are like, I'm never this way. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're always this way. You know what I mean? And so, and it goes for everyone. Think about what you're passive aggressive around, and that probably has something to do with your oppositional role.
Yeah.
Or your mercenary, as Denzel says.
Yeah, I'm a 9, so I can't run away from I definitely know that there's passive aggressive tendencies in me. And if anything, because I became aware of it, this shadow integration, then it's like, okay, now I can actually be aware, like, yep, this is a thing that's there, so I have to like work on it, which I have done over the years. But it's still, in the shadows. So like every now and then, yeah, it's just like sarcastic comments and stuff like that. It's so uncomfortable to talk about, but it's the shadow. That's what it is.
Well, don't worry. We all do those things. Not that we all do it exactly the same way you do it, but we all have our own ways that we get passive aggressive and oppositional and childish and all of that. All right, so then let's talk now about extroverted feeling for INFPs and ISFPs. So INFPs and ISFPs have dominant introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is very focused on individual values. What matters to the self? What matters to me? How can I live in alignment with my core values? Usually introverted feeling types have a kind of a gut sense of what's right or wrong for them and what feels good or bad to them. And so oppositional extroverted feeling is more about group values. What do other people feel, need, value? And so when INFPs and ISFPs become one-sided, they become so focused on being true to themselves that they become careless about what other people feel. It can look like being, say this situation with the Christmas lights. Your sister comes up to you and is like, hey, I'd really like to go see the Christmas lights with you. And you're like, well, I don't want to. So whatever. And maybe this, and not thinking about your sister and like how you can tell if you stretched outside of yourself that she really wants to do this and like she's really like looking forward to it. And now you've just crushed her. So a one-sided introverted feeling. And again, I've made it sound like a total jerk there. And usually introverted feeling types are not that way, because usually they can sense, well, if I feel this way, that person would feel that way. But either way, lopsided, unhealthy introverted feeling can be so focused on what you want or what feels right to you that it can be very careless about group values or how you're affecting other people. So when INFPs and ISFPs integrate extroverted feeling, they're able to connect with others and see that I'm not just an island. I am actually part of a bigger whole. I do affect my community, and I can see how I affect my community, and I can take some responsibility for how I affect the larger group of people around me. They can voice their values in a way that's more easily digested. So one thing extroverted feeling is really good at is having a way with words to make people want what you want them to want. And but with introverted feeling, when they integrate extroverted feeling, they might say, I have an unpopular value that not everyone agrees with, but let me appeal to these other people in a way that will get them to see my point of view more readily than if I just say, this is what I think. And it can allow them to hold space for others, even if they have different values. So both types of feeling, when they make space for the other type of feeling, become more accepting of others. So extroverted feeling types, when they integrate introverted feeling, become more accepting of other people who rock the boat, who are different, who might upset group values. Introverted feeling types, when they integrate extroverted feeling, they become more accepting of keeping the peace with people who, and supporting them, even if they don't have the same integral values that you individually do. When introverted feeling types integrate extroverted feeling, they're able to see ways they can support and nurture others better, and they can forge more intimate bonds through emotional expression. So INFPs and ISFPs can actually keep their feelings very close to the chest. There's a lot of misrepresentations of INFPs and ISFPs online, that they're these really constantly emotionally expressing themselves and crying all the time, being really weepy and hypersensitive all the time about things. But often what happens with introverted feeling dominant types is they are very protective of their feelings, and they don't necessarily share them unless they've developed a certain amount of trust with someone, and they can actually seem very stoic and very hard to read. So when they integrate extroverted feeling, they're more trusting of others and more able to express what they're feeling in a way that allows them to get close to people. Denzel, any thoughts from you? I'm sure you have thoughts. I'm excited to hear what you think.
Yeah, everything that you said is spot on. Because when you have the introverted feeling hero, and again, it's not all of them, but yeah, that there is a tendency. It's like, well, if I don't feel like it, then oh well. Because it's almost like the hyper, uh, the hyper spectrum, like hyper end of the spectrum, where it's like take care of yourself, like self-preservation, take care of yourself, all about me, self-care, whatever, to the point where now it's like you're not extending yourself at all outside of yourself for another person. And then you're like, oh, why don't I have any friends? And it's like, yeah, and of course there's the other extreme where it's like people who have so many friends, but they don't have any, they don't have any FI that's sticking into themselves. So again, there has to be a balance there. So actually learning to integrate more of that extroverted feeling, fifth function of I don't really feel like doing this, but I value this person and I value this relationship, because FE is the realm of relationships and interpersonal dynamics and stuff. So it's like, okay, since I value this relationship, I can sort of bring more desire to want to do this thing. Don't do it all the time, but having choosing your battles in that way. And I think another aspect that's really good for when introverted feeling integrates that extroverted feeling piece is being able to see outside of their own core values. There's a tendency for FP types at times to have the monopoly on certain core values of things. And it's like, I have figured out and I have thought of all of the moral injustices and stuff of that nature. And if somebody doesn't agree with it, first I will try to educate them. But if they still don't agree with it, then I block them, or I anything of that nature, because it's like, I am the right one. Nobody knows this more than I do. But what extroverted feeling teaches and integrates is, honestly, your moralistic view is not actually like an objective or an absolute. And harmony of extroverted feeling is kind of like everybody has their own view for a reason. And we can't always change that or influence it. But the best thing that we can do is be able to help each other understand. We can educate from our perspective. But at the end of the day, it's because we all have these kind of like different views and stuff like that, that the world goes round in the way that it does. And you don't have to be best friends with that person, sure, but you also don't have to demonize that person either. You're able to hold more space for their value or lack of values that might not be in alignment with yours. And you're able to just see like more of the bigger picture. And then, if you're integrating the TI too, then you're just kind of seeing also that like all of this stuff is actually really like absurd in any way, and it's arbitrary. But FI doesn't like that. So next topic.
I'll say, so I want to kind of bring up a side topic, even though we're running out of time, but I feel like I have to. So I think that that both feeling functions can demonize people who have different values, but in a totally different way. So it's like for FJs, what I've noticed is when they demonize people who have the different values, it's like they're like, well, they'll form the group in a bond of like, we have the right values.
This is
you
true.
don't have the good one. You know what I mean?
This is true.
And they'll say things like nicely, but not nicely, like bless your heart, or something like that. Whereas introverted feeling types will demonize, but they'll pull further away. Like, I am so misunderstood. I'm a misfit. Nobody understands me. And they pull away from people. I don't want to connect with anyone because they're all bad, whereas FJs are more likely to pull towards people in like maybe in a negative way towards like, we all agree this is bad, right? Like we're all in the same page here. Okay, good. And so it's like, and I mean, I'm not saying that thinking types don't demonize people. I mean, but I have seen like where it's like both feeling types can demonize people, but it's like the FJs pull towards the group and it's kind of like a mob in agreement with them, whereas the FPs are like gonna go hide in the shadows and be like, nobody understands me.
Yeah,
and even if you're a thinking type and you have extroverted feeling or introverted feeling, you might see yourself doing these same things. Like I'm a TJ, I'm introvert, but I am more likely when I feel like rejected or like my values don't align, I'm more likely to do the pull away thing. Like, oh, nobody gets me. And then I have a thinking husband who has extroverted feeling. He's more likely to talk to his friends and be like, isn't this crazy? What that this person did this crazy thing? So anyway,
yeah,
that's sorry to derail us a little bit.
No, that was good. That's helpful information. I'm glad that you said that.
I just wanted to make sure that the FPs weren't thinking they're the only ones that like that demonize people.
Oh yeah,
not that that's what you sounded like, but
yeah.
All right, so then let's get to the thinking functions. So oppositional introverted thinking for ENTJs and ESTJs. So ENTJs and ESTJs have dominant extroverted thinking, which is all about organizing and structuring the world to achieve certain objectives. And they look at things like evidence, statistics, empirical data data in the external world that they can use to get what they want. It's less focused on knowledge for its own sake or how something works, and more about using things efficiently to get objectives reached faster for ENTJs and ESTJs. So when it's lopsided, when it's one-sided, it can be very like steamrolling over everything to just get to a goal. Like, yeah, I want to reach this benchmark, or I want to maybe make this many sales. So I don't care if I understand all these systems or like have it all figured out. I'm just going to come up with something sloppy so I can get what I want. I used to work with an ENTJ who I designed catalogs for. And he would just be like, just throw it together, quick and dirty, quick and dirty. That was always the thing. And I've actually heard this statement used by ETJs many times, just quick and dirty. It's like, just get it done. And we have this deadline, and the catalog doesn't have to be perfect. And then there'd be all these sloppy mistakes. So when ETJs integrate introverted thinking, they become more patient. They learn to slow down and not just go for like the short-term gains and the short-term rewards, but actually look about how they can create systems and principles that will help them in the long term consistently. They can adopt more consistent principles. So ETJs can sometimes be a little loose with their principles if they're one-sided. And that can mean that maybe they say one day, oh, it's the most logical thing for us to, okay, now my mind's going blank. This always happens. Okay, so they might say, when I'm having this argument with this person, because I need to win this argument, I'm going to adopt this certain set of logical principles. But in this other argument, I'm going to throw out logic. I'm going to have lots of logical fallacies simply because then I need to win. Like the goal is to win, not to be logically consistent all the time. So when they integrate introverted thinking, they are more likely to stick with their logical principles, even if it might slow down their processes, or even if it might mean they don't win an argument or they don't reach the goal as quickly as they want to. So they become more patient and careful, and they learn how to work in a more comprehensive, in-depth way, thereby avoiding more errors or sloppy mistakes. So ultimately, it's a lot about slowing down. It's a lot about not having to win, not having to rush, not having to be all about getting to the end point as fast as possible, and actually understanding what logical principles do I want to adhere to all the time, and is this actually logically consistent? Do I actually understand how the system works that I'm trying to, if I'm making a product that I want to sell, for example, an unhealthy ENTJ might be like, here's this car. We didn't, I didn't really troubleshoot and test all the engine mechanics or whatever. I'm not a car person at all, so I should not be using a car analogy. But but it's good enough, so we'll just push it out there, and then people get into a lot of accidents. Integrating introverted thinking would be like, okay, let's actually test all the mechanisms of this vehicle to make sure that it actually works properly and the system is good. So when ETJs integrate introverted thinking, they become much more patient, much more thorough, and much more consistent in their logic. Denzel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, like that's totally in it. And yeah, they really just are more process oriented. Extroverted thinking tends to be more of a done, even if imperfectly done, is better than not done at all. And obviously, in many cases, that is very much true. But then in a lot of other cases, it's like, well, we should really like pay attention to the actual process of how the things are being done. So when you integrate that, then you're actually you're still getting things done, but you're getting them done in a precise, well processed way. And I think that that's the gift that TE DOMs can bring once they do integrate that TI realm.
Thank you, Denzel. All right, so let's move on to our last one. This is extroverted thinking for INTPs and ISTPs. So opposite problem. So INTPs and ISTPs are so focused on can be very focused on, they want to understand how things work in a very in-depth way, how the system works, how the system runs. They are more concerned with mental organization than they are with external organization. It's less about like, oh, I have to have my environment structured appropriately so I can reach a goal. And their focus is more on how can I have my thoughts organized so that I can think clearly. And so this tends to result in very thorough analysis, but a slower rate at which one accomplishes something. So TP types, ITP types are really usually very good at troubleshooting, because if there's a complicated problem, say your computer has a virus and you're not sure what to do about it, if you throw an ETJ at that problem, they might get really fed up fast because all they want to do is fix the computer, and they're thinking about the time, and they don't want to just have to dig into all these details of how this virus works. They just want to have a quick fix, especially if they're unhealthy. Whereas an ITP is like, let's take this apart. Let me figure out all the mechanisms that could be at play and all the different, systems that are working together to create this problem, and let me understand it in depth. And they're not as focused on the clock and just like fixing it right away. The problem is when introverted thinking is one-sided, it can start becoming very unproductive, like so focused on understanding things that it's not actually putting their ideas out into the external world. and maybe their environment is really haphazard and chaotic because they've got their thoughts all organized, but their external world is just a mess, because they're not getting their world outside themselves organized in a way that's going to help them achieve their goals. So in order for them to be more healthy, integrating extroverted thinking can help them to become more organized and structured. Integrating it can look like stopping and saying, my desk is a mess. I'd probably have clearer thoughts, and I'd probably get this task done faster if I actually organized my desk so everything was where I needed it to be. Or it could be writing a to-do list, or having an app that reminds you of your tasks, or things like that. Things that help them stay structured and help them have their external world in more order. And integrating extroverted thinking can mean that they flesh out their reasoning to include things like metrics, evidence, statistics. Extroverted thinking is logical in the sense that it looks at like what in the external world proves that something makes sense. And so when introverted thinking types integrate that, they pay more attention to things like the evidence, to the metrics, to the numbers. And integrating it also encourages them to get their thinking out into the world and helps them to use tools like to-do lists, like we talked about, using different tools in order to get their life more structured and more organized. Any thoughts, Denzel?
I think the only thing that I'll add is, like having just lost it. Shoot. Deadlines. Make sure that you challenge yourself to have certain deadlines, because especially as a TI dominant, you can be tempted to just keep on tinkering and tinkering and tinkering and trying to perfect it and finding more ways that you can perfect it, and it's not ready yet, and keep on trying to do it. But when you have like a deadline, it kind of like forces you to put it out there anyway. And you eventually like realize like, something's never going to be my ideal, but at least I got the job done and I got it as close as I could get it to there. And that's better, because if you're just constantly working towards your ideal, by nature, the ideal is never really going to be like attained. So it's best to just keep on trying to like shoot for the moon. And even if you miss, you'll still land amongst the stars. So yeah.
I love that example, Denzel. ITPs tend to want artistic control, which essentially means they want it to be perfect, whatever they're working on, and it's worth it if it takes more time to get there. But taken to an extreme degree, you can have someone who spends 30 years on something and still isn't sure about putting it out there yet.
Yes.
I know that it's getting close to the time when Denzel needs to sign off. So before that happens, Denzel, can you let people know where they can find you if they would like to book a coaching session or a profiling session with you?
Yes. So if you go to denzelmensa.com, you will find my services there. If any of the time slots don't work for you, just email me at denzelmensa94@gmail.com. Let me know, hey, I'm in China, and so your 8 a.m. to 5 a.m. time slots are not really like good for me because they're Eastern time. But this one day, do you mind having a session with me at like 2 a.m.? It's like, yeah, sure. Let's just book that for some time 3 weeks from now so I can mentally prepare for that. But yeah, like, if you want, then we can do that. And you can just book sessions over there. I also have like payment plans there. And I do relationship coaching as well. So you can bring your partner, or it could be just you. And, we work on, strengthening your relationship. And I profile. So sit down and interview you for about maybe an hour plus, and I explain to you in detail not only like which personality type that you are, but why you are in like very specific ways. I also do deluxe coaching, which is pretty much like helping you to either attain or achieve certain goals, or allowing yourself to have a better relationship with yourself and becoming a better version of yourself. So if you like any of these things and they appeal to you, hit up denzelmensa.com, and I will be happy to work with you.
Thank you, Denzel. And thank you, everyone who showed up today. We got some really good questions. And if you have other questions that we didn't get to today, please leave them in the comments. I read all the comments. I don't always get back to them right away. I know, because like I said before, I have 5 kids. So my time is always a little crazy, but we will answer them. And we would love to hear any questions that we didn't answer today. Thank you so much for taking your time out to be here. If you'd like to find out more about the opposing role, you can also check out my website at psychologyjunkie.com. There's a search engine there. You can just type in opposing role and you'll see an article. I also put the link to that article in the information below this video, so you can read that if reading is more your forte. But join us next week. We're going to be talking about the critical parent, which is the 6th function. And so that's going to be really exciting. And usually people have a lot of eye-opening moments when they start learning about that function as well. So join us next week. We'd love to have you. Thank you, everyone who showed up. Thank you, Denzel, for being a part of this. And we'll see you next week.